She collapsed in his arms before she ever spoke her name. He felt her weight, her breath, and her pain long before he understood what she meant to her people. By the time he reached the shelter of his cabin, the storm had already begun to swallow the world behind them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. The wind clawed at his hood as he pushed the door open with his shoulder, the wood groaning beneath the pressure of the storm that had followed them from the ridge. Snow spilled across the threshold, carried by violent gusts that sounded like distant voices, not supernatural, but the natural roar of the Arctic pushing against anything fragile enough to break. The woman in his arms barely moved as he crossed the room, her fur-lined parka torn near the ribs, the fabric stiff with frozen blood that had crystallized into dark, jagged petals. He lowered her onto the thick sealskin near the hearth, the heat struggling to rise through the cold that had settled into every corner of the room like a permanent inhabitant. His breath came in white bursts, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility he barely understood. Her braid, long and dark, was dusted with snow that refused to melt, trapped between strands like tiny memories of the storm. Outside, the ice shifted with a low, thunder-like groan, the sound traveling through the floorboards and into his bones, reminding him that the Arctic never allowed mistakes without consequence. He looked at her face then, sharp as carved stone yet softened by exhaustion, and wondered how someone who appeared unbreakable could have collapsed in the first place. The question haunted the back of his mind, blending with the cold air as he knelt beside her, unsure if she would survive the night. He reached for the small metal basin he kept by the stove, filling it with what little unfrozen water he had left, each drop echoing softly as it hit the bottom. His hands shook as he placed the basin near the fire, watching steam curl upward like breath from a sleeping animal. When he dipped the fabric into the warmth, the fibers darkened immediately before he pressed them gently against the woman's side, trying not to worsen the wound. She flinched not with fear, but with the instinct of a warrior who refused vulnerability even in unconsciousness, and he murmured something soft, not expecting her to understand. Her skin was cold, far colder than it should have been, and he knew that whatever had struck her down had not been the storm alone. The scent of ice, metal, and faint smoke clung to her clothing, a blend of travel and battle that made his chest tighten with questions he wasn't ready to voice. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin again, rattling the shutters and sending a shower of snow down from the roof. He kept working, pressing warmth into her body, reminding himself that saving her was all he was allowed to focus on, not the fear that lingered quietly behind his thoughts. And yet, as he watched her breathe, slow and shallow, he felt a pull he could not explain, a sense that the night would mark a before and after in both their lives. Hours passed as he tended to her, the fire rising and falling like a heartbeat trying to match hers. He fed the flames carefully, placing driftwood into the stove while listening to its crackle, a sound that felt almost comforting compared to the storm outside. His cabin, normally too small and too quiet, now felt crowded with urgency, filled with the presence of someone who didn't seem to belong to the same fragile world he did. Her hands, even relaxed, carried the calluses of someone who lived entirely through skill and instinct, someone who wielded tools he couldn't name with precision he couldn't imagine. The faint scent of tundra moss lingered on her clothing, mixed with the sharpness of wine-burned skin. He couldn't help noticing the details carved into the haft of the knife she carried, a tool of survival, not violence, resting near her belt where it had fallen. He tried not to dwell on the weight of responsibility, yet he felt it growing with every minute she lay motionless. The snowstorm outside had become a living thing, pressing its weight against his walls like a reminder that the world had narrowed to just the two of them. And still he worked, silently willing her to stay tethered to life long enough to open her eyes. When she finally stirred barely, like the world inside her was returning in small pieces, he froze with his hand halfway to the basin. Her eyelids trembled, heavy with exhaustion, revealing eyes the color of deep winter water, cold, sharp, aware, even in pain. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a ripple of agony through her body, and she collapsed back with a sound closer to a growl than a groan. He moved to steady her, speaking softly, telling her she was safe, though he knew she would decide for herself whether that was true. She glanced around the cabin, absorbing every detail: the fire, the walls, the tools, the snow being pushed under the door by the storm. Her gaze landed on him last, and there was no fear in it, only calculation, like she was weighing his intentions against her ability to stand. He saw strength there, not the kind built by muscle alone, but the type forged by years of surviving a land that broke lesser souls. Her lips parted, as if she intended to say something, but only a breath escaped. She closed her eyes again, but this time not in surrender. She was gathering herself, rebuilding whatever had been fractured before he found her. He stepped away to give her space, though the cabin offered little of it. The fire hissed as he added another piece of wood, sparks rising with a faint scent of pine that felt foreign in a place ruled mostly by ice. He had lived alone for nearly 3 years, ever since the accident on the southern trail, the one that had taken his brother and left him with silence he never learned how to fill. The cabin had become a refuge, a place where voices didn't echo with memory because no one spoke at all. But now, with her presence pulsing through the room like a quiet drum, he felt the old loneliness shifting, making room for something uncertain. He didn't know where she came from or why she had been traveling alone through a storm that even he, a man accustomed to the Arctic's harshness, would have avoided. Yet he sensed an unspoken purpose around her, something not mystical, but deeply human: duty, responsibility, the weight of someone who protected others long enough to forget how to let herself rest. He wondered if helping her would entangle him in whatever burden she carried. Still, he knew that letting her die would haunt him more than any danger she might bring. Outside, the storm began to lighten, not in peace, but in exhaustion, as if the sky had finally run out of rage. The wind softened into long, distant murmurs, and through the frost-laced window he could see the faint glow of the moon pressing through the thinning clouds. The ice beneath the cabin let out a long, resonant groan, a sound that traveled across the tundra like a message only the land understood. She shifted again, her breathing steadier now, her hand sliding instinctively toward the knife at her belt. He gently moved it closer so she wouldn't panic upon waking fully, a gesture of trust he'd hoped she would recognize. His fingers brushed against the carved patterns: valve, ice, wave, symbols of endurance and balance, etched by someone who understood the stories of the land. He returned to her side, adjusting the thick fur around her shoulders to preserve the heat she had begun to regain. A faint flush warmed her cheeks, melting the last crystals of snow still clinging to her skin. He exhaled slowly, relieved, though he knew the coming morning would bring more questions than answers. As he cleaned the basin and replaced the cloth, he caught himself studying the quiet rise and fall of her chest, noticing the steadiness returning to her breath. Her features had softened in sleep, no longer pulled tight by pain, revealing the youth hidden behind the strength. She couldn't have been much younger than him, yet she carried herself like someone who had spent decades bearing the weight of her people. He wondered whether she had family waiting for her, or if they would assume she had been taken by the storm. The thought tightened something in his chest, an echo of grief he hadn't expected to feel again. He pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was temporary. She would leave when she healed, and he would return to his quiet routine. But the land outside groaned again, and the sound carried a strange heaviness, like the ice itself knew that nothing about this night would be temporary. He stepped outside briefly to clear the drifted snow from the doorway, the cold slicing into him like a blade. The night sky had opened, revealing a thin band of stars trembling above the storm's fading remnants. The air tasted metallic, charged, carrying the distant rhythm of something heavy, not thunder, not animals, but the natural settling of snow across the frozen earth. He paused for a moment, letting the silence press against him, the way it always had since the accident. But tonight, silence felt different. It felt watchful, as if the land was studying him the same way she had. He returned inside quickly, breath burning his lungs, and closed the door behind him with a soft thud. The warmth wrapped around him like a promise he didn't trust, and he found himself glancing toward her again, drawn to the possibility of a life intertwined with something more meaningful than solitude. She shifted one last time before sleep claimed her fully, her expression tightening briefly with some internal memory he would never hear. He knelt beside her again, adjusting the furs and ensuring her wound no longer bled. The firelight flickered across her face, revealing faint scars that hinted at a life shaped by danger and duty. He wondered who she was before the storm, what had driven her across the ice, what force had demanded so much of her that she had collapsed into the arms of a stranger. He didn't expect answers, not tonight, maybe not ever. But he felt a quiet certainty growing inside him. Saving her had changed something fundamental in the world around him. And tomorrow, when the storm cleared and the tundra revealed whatever secrets it had hidden, he knew the land would respond to her awakening. When he finally lay down on the opposite side of the room, exhaustion settling into his bones, he listened to the way the fire breathed and the way her breath slowly matched its rhythm. The cabin felt strangely alive, no longer a cage of wood and ice but a temporary sanctuary holding to lives suspended between survival and destiny. His eyes drifted closed, but sleep didn't come easily. The weight of the day pressed into him, mingling with worrying, curiosity, and a faint sense of something approaching from far across the snow. He breathed deeply, letting the warmth seep into him. Yet even as he drifted toward rest, he couldn't shake the feeling that the land was preparing for something he couldn't name. And far beyond the horizon, though he did not hear it yet, the first distant echo of drums began to tremble across the ice. The fire had burned low by the time the first tremor of sound reached the cabin, so faint it could have been mistaken for the slow stretch of the ice beneath them. Yet something in the rhythm pulled him from sleep, a repetition too deliberate to come from the shifting land. He lifted his head from the rolled seal skin he used as a pillow, listening with the caution of a man who had lived long enough in the Arctic to know that nothing unusual arrived without consequence. The Huntress still slept across the room, her breathing steady, her face lit by the faint amber glow that clung to the last fragments of flame. The window beside him was coated in frost so dense it looked like carved glass, and behind it the early light of dawn strained to break through. The sound came again, low, distant, measured, traveling across the tundra with the patience of something ancient. He sat up slowly, aware that the world outside was announcing a change before daylight had claimed the horizon. He moved to the window, scraping away a thin line of frost with the back of his knuckle, revealing a limited view of the vast white stretching endlessly beyond the cabin. The storm from the previous night had flattened the drifts, smoothing the landscape into a clean expanse where every shape stood out with brutal clarity. The air was sharp enough to burn the inside of his nostrils even through the cracks in the wood. Again the sound pulsed a steady rhythm that reminded him of ceremonial gatherings he had witnessed from afar years ago, never close enough to understand their meaning. He wondered if the drums marked a celebration, a mourning, or a call for someone who had not returned. His stomach tightened with the knowledge that the woman sleeping on his floor might have been expected home long before the storm had claimed her strength. He turned toward her, noticing a faint twitch in her brow, as if even in sleep she heard what he now could not ignore. The day had not yet begun, but already he sensed its heaviness. He crossed the room quietly, careful not to disturb her, though he knew she would wake the moment her instincts deemed it necessary. Her hand still rested near the carved knife he had placed beside her the night before, a gesture meant to reassure, not alarm. He knelt and checked the wound beneath her parka. The bleeding had stopped, replaced by the sickly warmth of inflammation contained beneath the layers of fur and cloth. She would need herbs, salves, the kind of treatment he could not provide alone. He knew he should take her to her people, return her before complications stole what little strength remained in her body. And yet, as the drums trembled through the cabin again, stronger this time, he felt the weight of an unspoken truth settling into the room. The timing of the drums was not a coincidence. Whoever beat them was looking for her, or for the one who had carried her from the ridge. The thought pushed a tight breath from his chest, and he pressed his palms against the floorboards to steady himself. The cabin creaked under a shift in the wind, and loose snow drifted from the rafters, settling softly around him like cold dust. He stood, gathering his coat, sliding it over shoulders that had grown narrower over the years from isolation rather than labor. His reflection flickered briefly in the metal pot near the stove, eyes darker than before, cheeks sunken, beard unruly. Life alone had not been unkind, but it had stripped away the unnecessary, leaving only endurance. Now, with an injured stranger in his home and an unknown gathering forming somewhere beyond the horizon, endurance might not be enough. He moved toward the door but hesitated, turning once more toward her sleeping shape. She looked smaller like this, curled against the fur, yet he knew the truth. Even wounded, she carried more strength than he had felt in years. He hoped she would forgive him for letting anyone approach before she could defend herself. When he cracked the door open, the cold hit him with a force that felt personal, as though the Arctic itself resented the intrusion of warmth spilling from the cabin. His boots sank into the fresh snow, sinking above the ankles with a muted crunch, and his breath curled upward in thick spirals. The dawn was still forming along the horizon, washing the flattened tundra in pale blue light that made shadows appear softer than they truly were. The sound of the drums traveled clearer out here, carried by the wind with a direction he could not miss, east, toward the cluster of cliffs that hid a village he had approached only once in his life, and even then, only from a respectful distance. The rhythm pulsed with purpose, a heartbeat echoing across the land, unwavering, steady, patient. He knew enough to understand this. No one beat drums at dawn unless something grave demanded it. He scanned the horizon for movement, expecting smoke, figures, sleds, anything that might indicate the approach of others. But the landscape remained still, unnervingly pristine, as though the storm had erased all signs of life from the night before. He stepped farther from the cabin, the cold numbing the edges of his thoughts. The silence between the drumbeats grew heavier with each passing second, pressing a question he didn't want to answer. Were they calling her name? He didn't know the words her people used to summon their own, but he imagined the message behind the rhythm, a call not carried by speech, but by presence. A call she might understand instinctively the moment she woke. He wondered how she would react when she realized how far she had been carried while unconscious, how vulnerable she had been in the arms of a stranger. He wondered, too, whether her people would see him as rescuer or intruder. A sudden shift of snow behind him snapped him from his thoughts. He turned quickly, hand tightening around the small hatchet he kept at his belt, though he knew the gesture was useless against the kind of danger the Arctic delivered. But it wasn't danger that waited behind him, it was her. She stood barefoot in the snow outside the cabin, one hand pressed to her side, her breath forming unsteady clouds that rose and broke in the frigid air. Her braid had fallen over her shoulder, unraveled in places, and the wind carried strands across her face like black threads against pale skin. Her eyes, sharp, cold, unwavering, were fixed on the horizon where the drums echoed in patient intervals. She did not look at him at first, she listened. And her entire body, though weakened, responded to the sound with a tension that vibrated through the frozen air. He realized then how grave the moment was, for she looked not confused, but braced. When she finally turned to him, her voice was little more than a whisper carved from exhaustion. She spoke a word he did not fully understand, but he recognized the tone: warning. She reached for the doorframe, steadying herself, her breath catching with the pain that pulled at her ribs. He moved toward her on instinct, offering an arm she hesitated to take. Her pride resisted, but her body faltered, and she allowed herself to lean just enough to avoid collapsing into the snow. Up close, he saw how pale she had become, her cheeks drained of the faint warmth he had fought to restore through the night. Yet her eyes remained fierce, steady, unbroken. She spoke again, slower this time, and pointed toward the cliffs. He understood only fragments, but the meaning was unmistakable. The drums were not calling a celebration. They were searching, for her, and perhaps for the one who had lifted her from the ice. He guided her gently back into the cabin, closing the door against the cold that tried to follow them. She sank onto the furs with a controlled exhale, one hand clutching her side as the pain sharpened from the brief exposure. He knelt beside her, waiting for her breathing to settle before speaking. He told her she needed rest, that moving so soon after injury would only worsen her condition, that he would help her reach her people once she could stand without collapsing. She listened, but her gaze kept drifting toward the window, drawn by the steady rhythm pulsing through the land like a question she could not leave unanswered. She spoke again, her words clipped by discomfort, but he caught the shape of one phrase: too long. She had been gone too long. The storm had stolen time from her, and the drums marked the consequences of her absence. He lowered his gaze, absorbing the gravity of her situation, realizing that returning her would not be a simple act of rescue. Her people were not calling for a lost traveler. They were summoning a protector, someone whose absence disrupted the balance of the community. He wondered what role she played: hunter, scout, guardian, and why she had been alone in a storm that would have killed anyone less skilled. The fire crackled softly beside them, throwing light across the carved knife that lay near her hand. Symbols of duty, symbols of belonging. He envied her for that, for having a place that would beat drums for her return. He had no such place left in the world. The room grew warmer as the fire regained strength, but the weight inside it grew colder. She touched his wrist then briefly, firmly pulling his attention back to her. Her eyes held gratitude, yes, but also urgency, a silent plea wrapped in strength she was fighting to maintain. She needed him. Not as a savior, but as someone who understood the land well enough to carry her back before the drums shifted from searching to mourning. And he knew, with a clarity that made his chest tighten, that he would help her. Even if the journey carried risks he had long sworn never to face again. Outside, the drums grew louder, closer, more deliberate. The drums did not stop, they grew steadier, more intentional, as though the land itself were amplifying their rhythm. Inside the cabin, every beat traveled through the walls and into the floorboards, into the furs beneath the Huntress, into the breath he drew while kneeling beside her. The sound had become part of the morning, welded to the pale light filtering weakly through the frost-coated window. She sat upright now, leaning heavily on one arm, her jaw clenched in determination rather than pain. He watched the rise and fall of her shoulders, each breath a battle against the wound that tugged at her ribs. And still her eyes, sharp as broken ice, were fixed on the distant cliffs where the sound originated. Her body was too weak to travel, yet her will was already half across the tundra, pulled by duty stronger than exhaustion. He knew then that if he did not intervene, she would attempt to walk into the snow alone and collapse long before she reached her people. He stirred the fire, pushing new wood into the flames until the warmth spread across the room in restless waves. The air smelled faintly of burning pine and melting frost, an unusual combination in a place where heat was never guaranteed. She watched him with a calmness that felt heavier than fear, as if evaluating his intentions in silence. He knelt before her again and examined the wound, lifting the layers of fur and cloth with careful hands. The bleeding had stopped, but the swelling beneath the skin worried him. She needed herbs he did not have, salves brewed only by those who had learned them from elders around shared fires. Her people would know how to treat her. But he also understood that carrying her there across the broad, unforgiving snow would require strength he wasn't sure he still possessed. His mind replayed memories he wished he could silence. The last time he carried someone across the ice, their weight slipping from warmth to stillness between one breath and the next. She reached for his wrist again, firmer this time. Her fingers, though cold, held purpose. She gestured toward the cliffs, then to herself, then to him, forming a sequence he understood even without shared language. You must take me home. He looked away for a moment, stung by a fear he didn't want to acknowledge. The Arctic had taken everything from him once. Returning to the open expanse with someone whose people were already searching could entangle him in consequences far beyond his quiet life. Yet as he looked back at her, he saw not expectation, but trust, the cautious kind born only from survival. She was not asking for heroism, she was asking for the simple, human act of not leaving her behind. That, he realized, was something he could not refuse. He gathered supplies in silence, packing the essentials into a sealskin bag, dried fish, a handful of bitter roots, a small tin of rendered fat for the fire. His hands moved with the discipline of habit, though his mind drifted toward thoughts he had tried to bury. Leaving the cabin meant confronting memories frozen beneath the surface of the land. He wrapped thick furs around her shoulders, careful not to press against her wounded side, and she accepted his help reluctantly, her pride pulling against the necessity of depending on another. Yet she did not resist when he lifted her, her weight far lighter than he expected, as though strength alone sustained her more than flesh. She inhaled sharply as pain tightened through her ribs, but she did not cry out. Outside, the drums shifted their rhythm again, becoming slower, heavier, a message carried through the cold. Time is running thin. He stepped into the snow with her in his arms, the cold biting into his legs through the thick hide of his boots. The tundra lay open before them, still and wide, the sky washed in pale hues of morning. The storm had left a clean surface behind, unbroken except for gentle undulations carved by the wind. Every step he took sank deeper than he anticipated, forcing him to adjust the weight in his arms to keep her balanced. She rested her head against his shoulder, not in surrender, but in an effort to conserve strength. The cold stung her cheeks, turning them a sharp, wine-burned red. Her eyes remained open, scanning the horizon with a focus so intense he wondered whether she felt the cold at all. She murmured something faintly, a word he couldn't decipher, but the tone was unmistakable. She was urging him forward, toward the cliffs, toward the sound that awaited her. They moved slowly across the snow, the world around them silent except for the hollow crunch beneath his boots and the distant pulse of drums. His breath grew heavier, forming clouds that drifted behind them like a trail of brief-lived ghosts. The weight of her body shifted with every step, forcing him to adjust, recalibrate, find balance in a landscape that allowed none. His muscles strained, a deep burn spreading through the tendons of his arms and shoulders, as fatigue threatened to edge into his movements. Yet he kept going, drawn by a sense of responsibility that had rooted itself in him with surprising strength. The cold gnawed at the exposed skin beneath his beard, stinging his cheeks, numbing his jaw. He felt the heaviness of her breath against his collar, each one a reminder of the life he was carrying through the unforgiving expanse. They rested briefly behind a small ridge of snow hardened by the wind, its curvature offering minimal shelter. He lowered her carefully, his arms trembling not from the cold, but from the exhaustion settling deep into the muscles along his spine. She leaned back against the snowbank, her eyes narrowing as she listened to the drums, now clearer, closer, vibrating with urgency. She touched her side again, her fingers pressing lightly against the swelling beneath her clothing. He could see the discomfort tightening her expression, though she fought to keep her breath steady. He reached for his water skin, offering it to her, but she shook her head, pushing it gently back toward him. Her stubbornness was unyielding. She would not take more than she believed necessary. He admired her resolve, even as he silently wished she would allow herself more softness. When he lifted her again, her fingers clung briefly to his coat, not in fear, but in an unspoken acknowledgement that she understood the toll the journey took on him. The cliffs grew larger with every step, rising from the tundra like ancient guardians carved from the earth. Their shadows stretched long across the snow, cold and imposing, offering neither comfort nor threat, only truth. As they neared, the drums grew louder, echoing off the stone with a density that made the air vibrate around them. The rhythm had changed again, shifting into a pattern he could feel in his chest. He didn't know the meaning behind it, but she did. Her breath caught, her gaze sharpening with recognition, and he felt a tremor pass through her body that had nothing to do with pain. The entrance to the village appeared gradually, carved subtly into the natural contours of the cliffs so that it blended with the landscape. Smoke drifted from a narrow opening above, carrying the scent of burning driftwood mixed with something earthy he recognized faintly from markets many years ago. Figures emerged at the base of the cliffs, their silhouettes dark against the pale snow. They moved with deliberate precision, spreading out across the open ground as though preparing to receive someone of significance. He felt the weight of their attention long before they came close. The drums ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence thicker than the cold around them. She stirred in his arms, lifting her head with effort as her people approached. Her expression changed, not softened, but centered, focused, alive with determination that burned even through exhaustion. Her hand tightened around his coat, steadying herself as though preparing for a moment that required all of her remaining strength. He could feel the shift in her posture, the way her body straightened despite the pain threatening to pull it down. She was no longer the injured woman he had carried through the storm. She was something more, someone who belonged to this land, to these people, to the rhythm of the drums that had called her home. As the group halted a short distance away, he felt something settle into his bones, a realization he had tried to ignore. Bringing her back would not end the story. It would begin something he was not prepared for, something the land itself seemed to anticipate with measured breath. The drums fell silent, but the consequences had only just begun. The silence after the drums ended felt heavier than the storm that had nearly killed them both. It pressed into the air with a weight that made every breath colder, every movement slower, every instinct louder. As he stood holding her before the group of villagers, the land itself seemed to pause, listening, waiting for a verdict not yet spoken. The huntress lifted her head with an effort carved from sheer will, her jaw tightening against the pain that radiated from her wound. She was weakened, unsteady, yet she held herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to standing at the front of a line, the one others looked to before stepping into danger. Her people watched her in silence, their faces carved by wind and experience, their eyes reflecting the weight of seeing a protector return injured and carried by a stranger. Nothing about their stance was hostile, yet nothing was welcoming either. They were assessing not him, but the meaning behind her condition. He adjusted his grip around her carefully, feeling the tremor in her muscles as she tried to straighten, wanting to meet her people standing on her own 2 feet. But she did not have the strength, and he felt her weight dip briefly before he steadied her again. One of the villagers stepped forward, an older woman wrapped in thick layers of fur so heavy they moved like armor. Her hair, long and streaked with gray, was braided intricately on both sides, and her eyes held a depth he recognized immediately, wisdom honed by years of surviving what others could not. She studied the injured huntress first, her gaze moving across the wound, the dried blood, the strain etched into her breathing. When the woman finally looked at him, her eyes did not accuse, they measured. She asked a question in her language, one he did not understand, but the tone carried a simple message. Were you the one who brought her back? He nodded once, unsure whether the gesture carried the weight she intended to receive. The older woman's expression did not change, but the villagers behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, the tension in their shoulders easing just enough for him to see relief mingling with caution. The huntress touched his arm weakly, signaling for him to lower her. He hesitated, but she met his eyes with a clarity that cut through the exhaustion. She needed to stand, even if it cost her. He lowered her slowly until her boots met the snow, her legs trembling beneath her weight. She clung to his forearm only long enough to steady herself before letting go, lifting her chin toward her people in a gesture of resilience rather than defiance. Her breath shuddered, but she remained upright, rooted by pride deeper than pain. The older woman stepped closer, placing a steadying hand on the huntress's shoulder, guiding her gently toward the entrance carved into the cliffs. The villagers parted to create a path, their faces reflecting something he could not name: respect, worrying, and something like recognition. As the huntress moved past him, she reached for his hand briefly, her fingers brushing his with a gratitude so subtle it could have been mistaken for the wind. Yet he felt it, the weight of it, the meaning behind a gesture she had not allowed herself to offer even while in his arms. Then she released him and followed her people into the shelter of the cliffs, leaving him standing outside in the open snow, uncertain of whether he was meant to follow or remain behind. He stood there long enough for the cold to begin threading its way through his coat, numbing the tension along his shoulders. The villagers did not beckon him inside, but neither did they order him away. They simply watched him, silent, unreadable, as though waiting for him to decide for himself where he belonged. He felt the old instinct rise within him, the instinct to retreat, to return to solitude before he became entangled in lives not meant to intersect with his. But something deeper overpowered the urge. The memory of her collapsing in his arms, the weight of carrying her across the tundra, the trust in her final glance before she entered the cliffs, they anchored him to a place he did not yet understand. For the first time in years, he was not alone. And the weight of that realization pressed harder than the cold ever had. The older woman emerged again, motioning for him to follow. There was no urgency in her gesture, only a steady expectation that he would obey if he sought answers. He approached slowly, the crunch of snow beneath his boots echoing faintly against the stone. As he entered the passageway carved into the cliffs, the temperature shifted subtly, warmer than outside yet still touched by the breath of winter. The walls were smooth in some places, rough in others, carved by generations who had shaped their home around the land rather than against it. The passage led into a large chamber lit by all lamps placed in recessed stone, their flames flickering softly, casting long shadows that swayed across the walls like moving history. The huntress lay on a raised platform covered in layered furs, surrounded by 3 women who tended to her with practiced hands. They removed her outer garments carefully, revealing the depth of the bruising and the swelling that had worsened since dawn. They spoke quietly to her in their language, their voices calm, steady, firm in reassurance. She responded weakly, her breath hitching as they applied salves of earthy, pungent herbs that filled the chamber with a scent he recognized only from distant memories of shared markets along the northern coast. Despite the pain tightening her expression, she did not cry out. Her eyes, half open, drifted toward him when he entered, and though exhaustion dimmed her gaze, relief flickered within it, relief that he had not walked away. The older woman motioned for him to sit on a low stone bench near the wall. She took a seat beside him, her posture straight, her presence commanding without being imposing. She spoke slowly, enunciating words he only partly understood, but her tone conveyed meaning beyond language. She asked where he had found the huntress, how long she had been unconscious, what circumstances had brought them together on the ridge where storms rarely showed mercy, he answered with quiet honesty, describing the moment he found her kneeling in the snow, gripping her side, the wind tearing at her strength until she collapsed. He told her of carrying the Huntress through the storm, of tending to her wounds through the night, of following the drums at dawn because it felt wrong to keep her from her people. The older woman listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on him with the focus of someone evaluating truth, character, and motive all at once. When he finished, she looked toward the Huntress, who had fallen into a shallow sleep. The women tending to her continued their work with a reverence that suggested she was not merely a member of their community, but someone who bore specific responsibility: protector, scout, perhaps even something more nuanced he could not grasp. The older woman placed a hand on his arm, not in comfort, but in acknowledgement. She spoke again, slower, her words woven with gravity. Though he did not understand everything, he caught enough to feel the weight of what she conveyed. The Huntress had not been traveling aimlessly. She had been returning from a task essential to her people, one she had accepted knowing the dangers it carried. Her injury was more than misfortune, it was a disruption to the balance she upheld. As he absorbed this, the ground beneath them vibrated faintly, a deep, muffled tremor that traveled through the stone. It was not the drums this time. It was something heavier, more distant, like the shifting of massive pressure across the ice fields beyond the cliffs. The older woman's expression tightened, and the women tending the Huntress paused, exchanging glances that carried quiet concern. The tremor faded, but its presence lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. He felt his stomach knot, sensing that whoever had injured the Huntress was not finished with the land or with her people. She opened her eyes again, wincing as she tried to lift her head. The older woman moved to her side, placing a comforting hand against her shoulder, guiding her gently back. The Huntress spoke a few strained words, her voice rasping with pain and urgency. Though he did not understand the language, he recognized the tone instantly. She was insisting she had to rise, that she had to continue whatever she had begun before the storm. The older woman responded with firmness, refusing her request, reminding her without raising her voice that even protectors must heal before fighting the cold again. But the Huntress pressed her hand against her stomach, drawing a shape in the air, a gesture he recognized from the night before. A warning, a signal, a sign of something she had witnessed. He felt the room shift again, not physically, but emotionally, as the weight of her message sank into those who understood her words. Her people exchanged glances, their expressions turning serious, calculating, touched by something like foreboding. The older woman's breath deepened, her jaw tightening as she considered the implications. She turned back to him, her gaze sharp, studying him with a different kind of attention, one not rooted in suspicion or gratitude, but in deliberation. He realized with a faint shiver that he had stepped into something larger than a simple rescue. The Huntress had not merely been injured. She had returned with knowledge her people had not expected, and now he was the only outsider who knew where she had come from and what she had endured. The chamber grew quiet, filled only by the crackling of all lamps and the faint hum of wind passing through the stone corridors. The Huntress, exhausted, drifted back into sleep. The older woman rose slowly and signaled for him to follow her deeper into the cliff sanctuary. He hesitated, glancing back at the Huntress one last time. Her breathing was steadier now, her face relaxed in sleep, but something in her expression carried tension, as though she dreamt of unfinished battles waiting in the snow. He stood, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders once again, and followed the older woman deeper into the stone. Whatever awaited him there would not be simple. And whatever the Huntress had tried to warn them about had already begun to move across the ice. By the time the Huntress could stand again, supported by the carved staff her elders brought her, the land beyond the cliffs had begun to settle into a tense and watching silence. She walked slowly but with purpose, her steps guided by both pain and responsibility, the weight of what she had witnessed still pressing beneath her ribs as sharply as the wound itself. He followed beside her, not out of obligation, but because the journey they had endured had woven their paths together in a way neither had chosen yet both understood. As they reached the ridge where the ice stretched wide and unbroken, she stopped and looked toward the horizon, her expression tightening with the memory of the danger she had tracked before the storm. The elders waited behind them, listening as she described movements across the far tundra, shifts in the ice that were not natural, migrations disturbed, patterns disrupted in ways that spoke of approaching struggle. Though he could not understand every word, he felt the tension settle into his bones, recognizing that the land itself was preparing for a season harsher than those recorded in recent memory. When she turned to him, the gratitude in her eyes held a depth that speech could not reach. She lifted her hand to his chest, resting her palm lightly against the fabric of his coat, an acknowledgment of the night he had carried her through, wind sharp enough to carve stone and choices heavy enough to carve a man. The villagers watched the gesture with quiet understanding, their expressions softening toward him, as though seeing for the first time the full shape of his role in her survival. The older woman spoke to him then, her tone solemn, carrying an invitation hidden between its lines. He would not be turned away if he chose to remain among them, nor would he be forgotten if he chose to go. The huntress met his gaze with a steadiness that reached past gratitude into something gentler, a possibility forged not by romance but by shared endurance, the rare kind of connection that only forms between two people who have faced death on the same horizon and returned because one chose not to let the other fall. They walked back toward the shelter of the cliffs together, the cold wind rising behind them, sweeping across the landscape as though sealing the past days into the ice where stories of survival are kept. The drums did not sound again, but he knew their echoes would remain with him long after the snow buried their vibrations. The huntress walked slowly, still healing, yet every movement carried renewed strength he had helped restore, strength she now extended back toward him simply by walking at his side. And as the sky shifted into the quiet blue of evening, he felt something settle in his chest for the first time in years, not the end of loneliness, but the beginning of belonging. For the ice, untouched and ancient, remembers those who walk it alone, but it remembers even more deeply those who choose to carry each other home.